Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We are going to continue on with this week's theme of album openers, looking at tracks that kick off an album. Today we're going to be looking at a band called Aquilus. We're going to check out the track Nihil, which starts off their album Griseus. So, let's see what Aquilus is bringing to the table today. Very ominous. Intentions are shrouded. Kind of haunting, but still the emotions obfuscated a bit. Of course it's metal. Ooh. Very Alan Menken with that turn. Really interesting the turn this took. Yeah, there's that haunting half-step idea. tons of reverb on that vocal. Everything else is rather clear, but that vocal just muddies itself up. Yeah, reintroducing concepts from the opening. Different instruments, similar vibe. Similar vibe. See, and here the reverb I think really works well. The guitar has a bunch of it on it, but it kind of gives it a dreamy feel. It works in the context of the strings around it. I love how that string progression wasn't too dark. It had a little bit in it, but the guitar line above it is what really extracted that darkness and extrapolated on it. Gentle optimism in unknowing. Yeah, this whole thing is like a dark beauty. I'm curious who this composer's inspirations are outside of the metal. Like, where do they get their... redemption? Definitely more powerful than anything we've heard before. There's strength here, both in width and conviction of chord progression. Also very cyclical. 2 chords, a rise, and a return. That's our four chord phrase. 3 of our chords are the same one. That beautiful fast finger picking technique. feels like all this could collapse any second. There's so much tension within this victory, the success. Yeah, this is rejoice right here. But there's something underneath that isn't. Whatever that tension was seems to have been resolved. Ooh, ooh, whoa. That was clever. So keep that last section in mind. I'm going to talk about it as soon as we're done here. Not where I thought the story was heading. I was expecting to find some peace or rest here in their final moments, but that eerie darkness is creeping back. And it's left just hanging there. Those two chords vamping back and forth were not exactly based around any strong concepts of resolution, because resolution tends to need more chords. You can certainly move from rest to tension to rest, but that's not really a strong resolution. That's just jumping between two states. So we just kind of end in that vague sound. Interesting. Like I had mentioned, the first thing I'm going to talk about is that finale to the big bombastic section before going into our outro there. We had this beautiful chord progression in a ascending pattern that just took us higher and higher and landed us on this really big moment. Instead of continuing on, we paused, we held it out, we had this big fermata. And I was like, yes, beautiful, great resolution there. And it sounded like in, any other band probably would have stopped there and allowed the instruments to naturally fade out. or unnaturally fade out, I guess just do a decrescendo, right? To have this nice fade out into our outro, which probably would have been something like what we had. A couple of light instruments to contrast everything and to wrap everything up. But instead, we had one more progression that gave us another 8 bars. And it didn't feel like we could go anywhere. Immediately, we would end the resolution here. We would have to break it. But instead, we did a key shift so that our resolving chord that we landed on became a leading chord for the next progression. It was so beautifully done. Ah, man, that was immaculate. I'm not sure the point of it. The song was over. Why extend it out to be over again? We landed on another resolved chord only 8 bars later, just in a different key, and we had already hit the high point, so it sort of just dragged out this peak. And maybe there was a thematic or narrative reason for it, but on a first time listen, it's just like, all right, we hit the high point. We're still at the high point. We're continuing on with the high point. When are we done with this? And I guess it does kind of create a tension, right? Now you're wondering. It goes against convention, it goes against expectation, and it just drags out a moment that should not have been dragged out, which feels unnatural in a sense when you word it that way. And then we do end up moving into that tension again. We had a good solid 6 minutes maybe of rather bright music contrasted heavily with the darkness we started the track in, and I really thought we were landing on a resolution. That's how we were going to finish the track out. And I guess the extension there to break expectation, to push against it, and then using that concept of kind of being tripped up. You're like, oh, I thought we knew where we were going. Where are we going now? To have this darkness be brought back up in our outro. I guess it kind of makes sense from that angle. It's one of those things you just got to talk through. They don't make sense on the surface, but you just start speaking your thoughts and maybe come to a conclusion on it. That happens often with me. um, but yeah, that key change though was masterful. Just so good. Oh man, that's the kind of writing I aspire to right there. Tricked me, but did it in a way that's so satisfying. Yeah. All right. So, what's going on in this track though? Honestly, I'm gonna just kick off right here with a little bit of harsh criticism. That's gonna lean a bit biased. Like every single time the drums came in, I wish they won it. I truly believe, and the vocals too. Yeah, man, they just burn the atmosphere every time. The guitars, I'm kind of 50-50 on. Sometimes I felt like they removed from the atmosphere. Sometimes I felt they were required to achieve the atmosphere they were going for. Sometimes you need that extra bite and distortion to get where they were going. But man, the drums were just every time I was like, nope, please don't play here. And I don't even think it's necessarily the drum composition, although I think the black metal double bass kicks didn't fit anywhere in this track. But I do think a lot of it's also the production of it. You have these nice, clear instruments. There's a little bit of compression. There's a little bit of like a film grain, an auditory film grain going on with this track. It isn't a crystal clear pop production. And the instruments do feel a bit too close. They don't feel very wide like an orchestral recording. But there's clarity. Even if it's not a clean production, it's very clear. And the drums end up being a bit muddy, just like the vocals end up being a bit muddy, and they just clash aesthetically with what everything else in the band is doing. And it just never quite came to a point where it worked for me. I want to emphasize that, for me. If you listen to this and you loved it and you're like, no, removing the drums would make it garbage, your opinion is valid as well. Um, I'm also kind of coming at this from a different angle. I know a lot of you are metal listeners and you probably hear this as metal with symphonic elements. I hear this from a symphonic angle. from an orchestral angle. I hear really great classical music that every once in a while shoehorns in some metal, and it just, from that angle, it feels odd. Especially in this context. If it was, like I said, the production, if it was just a little clearer, if this was symphonic metal that really aims for that crystal clear production, stuff like Nightwish and Epica, I don't know that it would have bothered me as badly. But the black metal aesthetic, I just don't feel fit with everything else that these guys achieved throughout the rest of the track. And it really made me appreciate the middle 40% a lot more so than the opening 20%, because we had the intro was gorgeous, and then we brought in the blackened elements, and then the drums came in during our big bombastic section there at the end right before our outro too. But the middle section that was just pretty much straight string work was just so good. Alright, so with that minor criticism out of the way, I'm not going to be talking about the drums or the vocals going forward. I'm going to primarily focus on what the strings were doing. All the strings. Let's just toss the guitars in there. You don't typically think of them in the string section, but they're a stringed instrument, so let's do it. This song is really interesting. It is hyper-focused on chord progression, and through this, the song is able to tell a very complex, emotive story. And that's not to say that we don't have elements of melody. I mentioned at that one point, it was after the end of our first black metal section, and we brought it down, and we had that finger-picked acoustic guitar with the violins behind it. A very small section. And I mentioned how the chords that the violins were playing were not super dark, but that the melody pulled out a darkness and amplified it. So it's not like we're devoid of melody, and the melody is very important in the places that it is, but a lot of this is based off of chord progression, and we're not just talking simple 4-bar progressions. We do have elements of that, but if you look at larger 16 or 32 bar phrases, you'll see a lot of movement going on in the chord progressions that you don't see on the smaller 2 or 4 bar ideas. What I'm saying is, we do have these smaller phrases, but the bigger picture is comprised up of a series of linear implementations of these smaller licks that we have, and through that we get these really complex emotions in each of the sections, because we get to explore a lick, maybe a couple of, not a lick, a progression, maybe a couple of times, and then an expansion on the progression, then an inversion on the progression, and then a variation on the progression. And this allows us to hear this story being told through a complex series of emotions based on all the different note intervals that we get across these different progressions. It is really great work. It is why every section felt multifaceted despite the repetition happening on the minutia. And it really shines through in our opening. When the song opened up, we have a small string trio, I think, that slowly opens up. We had more layers, we had a couple more strings, we had the guitars, then we had the drums and the vocals. Like, it's this building layering idea, right? But in the opening concept, we really don't have a strong melody, if I remember correctly. What I remember is a very intricate chord progression, and it led us through a lot of ideas. It was haunting, but it was also hidden. There were elements of it that felt haunting and eerie, but also ones disguised by fog. And it made it really difficult to get a read on what was going on, but overall it was unsettling, and I think that that is the main point. But it isn't just unsettling because it's creepy or eerie, it's a lot of things, but it's amplified by the fact that some passages feel like they betray other emotions we have seen, and it becomes mysterious in a sense, where the emotional element of the track is not always as it seems. Something is a little off here, and that being off, that's okay. We went here, we went here. That's kind of an eerie progression. That's kind of a haunting progression. And then we went here. Why would they do that? Why would anybody do that? That's not where the chord was telling us we were going. Well, that's kind of weird. And now things seem out of place. Kind of uncanny valley chord progression style, where you can kind of see where things went and the chord progression works, but that is not the way it's supposed to be. There's something weird going on here. And so it just elevates the uncanniness, the fear, the haunting, the eeriness, the creepiness to it all. And not only that, but we don't have a lot of time to sit in these emotions because, as far as I could tell, it was fairly linear. The chord progression had these little micro loops, but on the whole, we were consistently going to different emotions, different chordal movements, and the progressions themselves are always changing. And that was fascinating. It was like this amorphous emotion where it was a lot of things all at once and in combinations that didn't seem natural. And it really makes that opening creepy. Skipping over the black metal part. No, I'll touch on it real quick because we do get our first taste of our distorted guitar here. And I think at this moment it kind of works. Right? So we have our orchestra going on, our string quartet, I'd say maybe tops. We have them going on, they got chord progressions. And the guitars come in, and what they do is while the strings are holding out notes, the guitars are playing 16th notes of the same root note of the chord, if my ears were correct. And what this allowed it to do is, I've said many times in the past, that when I listen to black metal now, I tend to not hear all the attacks, right? All the picking, because a lot of the times the note doesn't change. And I'm just listening to when the notes change, and that's exactly how the strings end up playing it. So what we get is the texture of all the attacks. We get the texture of the compression and distortion, but it's somehow applied to this held out tone that only had one attack. Going along with these ideas of impossible combinations from our opening, we land here where it simultaneously sounds like we have one stroke, but a continuous series of attacks. And just how is that possible? How do you strum something once and it continues to have that initial attack to it? And of course, it's due to the layering here. Like, I know why it happens, but when you hear it, and the string, the violin and the guitar start to meld together as a sound, it becomes something unnatural, something that shouldn't exist. It leans into that aspect that the intro was utilizing and showcasing in the chords. It's a very cool way to expand on this idea. From this moment, we continue to explore these variations of darkness and eeriness, but we begin to pepper in a couple of bright ideas. Bright concepts, bright chords. There is that one twist that we had while the dude was screaming. And it was like darkness, darkness, heaviness, darkness, bright, and resolution. And then back to the darkness. And I had mentioned it sounded like Alan Menken. He is a fantastic composer. He is just so good at writing large, triumphant songs about overcoming personal hurdles. And these types of resolutions are exactly what you would hear in his peaks at the end of a track when we hit our high point. And it immediately made me think of Aladdin and Little Mermaid, and just the types of intervals that he utilizes to showcase these characters in their happiest. in their most triumphant moments, without danger, of course. Just triumph, just being who they want to be. Because funny enough, both of those, wow, both of those movies are about somebody who is not who they should be. Aladdin is a lot more than just a street rat, and Ariel, they both their names start with A. And Ariel is much more than a king's princess. She wants so much more out of life, she has more to give it. And they both undergo transformations and find out that that wasn't for them. Actually, no, Ariel does keep her legs at the end, doesn't she? Okay, that doesn't. Anyways, we are a wide tangent here. Anyways, Alan Menken, fantastic with these types of themes. And this turn here, it's really interesting because it comes after all this darkness. And I feel like it's supposed to be foreshadowing where we're going, but at the moment it feels very out of place, especially when we go back into and restart this progression and we're back into that darkness and the brooding. But there is a point right at the end of all this black metal, darkness, and aggression when things kind of lighten up. Chordally, we kind of hit a neutral area, but sonically, we ditch all the layers. We start down with just two, and we begin to build this up again, but in a different direction. We started out in a moody atmosphere, filled with dread and darkness, and now we're in a moody atmosphere filled with unknowing, uh, unsure, uncertainty, possibly. And we begin to build this up, but this time with less of the aggressive elements, no vocals. The electric guitar doesn't come until much later, and we again begin to expand on these ideas of sort of a neutrality to it all. Once again, lots of great interplay with the chords and great use of melody to extrapolate some of the concepts out of the chords that they want to specifically focus on. This acts as a middle point to the track before we end up in our big point, the big bombastic section that we build into. And there's a point in here where we start transitioning out of the uncertainty, the neutral chords, into these bright, harmonious, resolved, triumphant stuff. And it almost sounds at one point like film score for a big battle. We end up having a very large orchestration of instruments placed in a very large area as well. As far as EQing and placement go, the sound sphere opens up quite a bit. It's still on the compressed side. It still feels like a metal production, but it really pushes the bubble out quite a bit, and introduces multiple instruments per instrument, if that makes sense. It's not just one violin anymore. It's like three violins and three cellos and three violas and stuff like that, which just gives each of these instruments a bigger, more pronounced sound. And we begin this building idea. Again, we start from nothing. We build up and build up in volume. We build up in complexity of chords. We build up in intensity of emotion, where, like I mentioned, we sort of transition out of the neutrality into this positivity. But we have to build up out of that as well. And we end up having these really sharp chords coming out of our lower end cello work. It's like bump, 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 bump. We accent a really hard attack, and we kind of lean off of it a little bit. And again, it comes off as aggressive, like I had mentioned, like a film score for a battle. Interestingly, though, we don't really go into a battle sound, but we do enter into something that is triumphant. It is, heroic music. I'm really curious where this comes from. If you had told me that the moody, dark, sitting in a graveyard at midnight and catching something out of the corner of your eye intro would have led to something erring on the side of fantasy war film score, I don't think I would have believed you. I really have a difficult time figuring out how we got here. I think the elements are nice. Dark, neutral, light. I like that progression. Um, I just don't know why it's this specific kind of victorious, heroic kind of light and not something a bit lighter and personal. This feels very larger than life. This is a very large scale section, especially since we've added more instruments to the sound. I don't know, I'm very confused by it. And then, of course, we already talked about this. It gets bigger, it gets larger. We end up having a ton of layers in here. We get competing melody lines. Um, Not competing, but counterpoint, where they're working together. Um, and we have this rising idea. We hit this high note. We do the key change. We go to an extension of this peak. We really sit in this moment for a long time. Almost like whatever we accomplished, we either want to keep residing in, or what we accomplished is actually horrific, which I kind of want to lean on, right? Because what did I say earlier? I said that sitting in this moment was building tension. And it's almost like you accomplish your task and then you realize what it is you accomplished, and you have to stay in that high of finally finishing this, but realizing the horrors of what it means that you've done this. And then it all falls apart, metaphorically. I don't know if that's what really happens, but everything kind of diminishes and just leaves, and we're left with this very somber, slightly dark, no resolution ending. Kind of puts us back where we started, maybe a little less so, which I think is an interesting journey to go on, too. If we start at a 3, we go through the peaks and valleys of our story, we end up on like a 10, but the 10 is not great, and we end up slumping way back down, and narratively, as a character, as a story, we're now at like a 2 or a 1. We're actually worse off than when we started our journey, which is not usually how stories go. Usually the victory puts us at a higher status than where we started. We're happier now that we found love, or we feel more sure of ourselves now that we've overcome hurdles, and stuff like this, right? You're always in a better place than where you started. And that's not what this story feels like. So, speaking of the story, that's what I felt musically through this. Let's see what they are telling me lyrically, and we'll wrap this up and see if we can't find a middle point between the two. Oh, okay. This kind of works. Um, this just seems to be about reliving history, your own history, going through your memories, the bittersweetness of all that. It appears, from what I've read, what I understand, I should say, that our narrator, our protagonist, our main character, misses someone dearly and dreams of them. But as with all dreams, one must wake. It says at the very end, I arose from the dream, and you were gone, still embracing ashes of what never was, the torment of nothingness. And yeah, being able to. There's actually not a lot of lyrics here. There's a lot less than I expected. Um, but it just speaks. A lot of this speaks about where this person currently is in life. Like one part says, mountain winds caress and soothe my lustful soul to quieten my bleak breast and enchant the dreams of old. Just, I think, in a very flowery way, to say that, um, I have nostalgia for the old times. I miss the things that were in my past. And the mountain winds help calm me down from that, right? In a metaphorical way, right? Just being here allows me to relive some of that. But as it states at the end, you wake up from the dream and the person you miss is still gone. And that hurts. Calls it a torment of nothingness, which I think is perfectly encapsulated by our final section of the track. Not only is it, like I mentioned, a lower point than when we started, right? Because basically reliving this dream and going through these memories and re-experiencing time with this person you miss is just opening old wounds. And they take longer to heal. You got to form that scab all over again. If this happens frequently, it can be very tormenting, as stated at the end, a torment of nothingness. And you can easily end up in a place worse off as far as your grief process than you started. And I think that's what this is about. The bittersweet element of remembering people who have passed. And worse yet is not just memory, but dream, where it feels real, feels like they're back in your life, and then you wake to realize they're not. Those are my thoughts on Aquilus' Nihil. Dang, the album opens like this. Golly, this feels like it's probably a bleak album, isn't it? If it's gonna start with a topic like this, man. And it goes into the next track called Loss, which I think kind of perfectly lines up with where they are already here. Let me know what you thought, though. Did you enjoy this? Anything that stood out to you? Anything you'd like to add on to what I said or correct me on? Put those ideas down in the comments. Above that is a description box. In there you'll find a link to Linktree. Takes you to this menu right here. You can find my music, a link to the Discord server, ways to support the channel, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three. Alright, we have a special selection today. I'll also be back tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 p.m. UTC. We are going to wrap up this week's theme of, what are we doing? Album openers? and check out a special selection and a creator request. You know, the usual trio we do on a Friday. Alright, until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.